Chapter 23. The King's Gratitude. The two men were on the point of darting towards each other when they suddenly and abruptly stopped, as a mutual recognition took place, and each uttered a cry of horror. "Have you come to assassinate me, monsieur?" said the king, when he recognized Fouquet. "The king in this state!" murmured the minister. Nothing could be more terrible indeed than the appearance of the young prince at the moment Fouquet had surprised him. His clothes were in tatters. His shirt, open and torn to rags, was stained with sweat and with the blood which streamed from his lacerated breast and arms. Haggard, ghastly pale, his hair in disheveled masses, Louis XIV. Presented the most perfect picture of despair, distress, anger, and fear combined that could possibly be united in one figure. Fouquet was so touched, so affected and disturbed by it, that he ran towards him with his arms stretched out and his eyes filled with tears. Louis held up the massive piece of wood of which he had made such a furious use. "Sire," said Fouquet, in a voice trembling with emotion, "do you not recognize the most faithful of your friends?" "A friend! You!" repeated Louis, gnashing his teeth in a manner which betrayed his hate and desire for speedy vengeance. "The most respectful of your servants," added Fouquet, throwing himself on his knees. The king let the rude weapon fall from his grasp. Fouquet approached him, kissed his knees, and took him in his arms with inconceivable tenderness. "My king, my child," he said, "how you must have suffered!" Louis, recalled to himself by the change of situation, looked at himself, and ashamed of the disordered state of his apparel, ashamed of his conduct, and ashamed of the air of pity and protection that was shown towards him, drew back. Fouquet did not understand this movement; he did not perceive that the king's feeling of pride would never forgive him for having been a witness of such an exhibition of weakness. "Come, sire," he said, "you are free." "Free!" repeated the king. "Oh, you set me at liberty, then, after having dared to lift up your hand against me." "You do not believe that!" exclaimed Fouquet, indignantly. "You cannot believe me to be guilty of such an act." And rapidly, warmly even, he related the whole particulars of the intrigue, the details of which are already known to the reader. While the recital continued, Louis suffered the most horrible anguish of mind, and when it was finished, the magnitude of the danger he had run struck him far more than the importance of the secret relative to his twin brother. "Monsieur," he said, suddenly to Fouquet, "this double birth is a falsehood. It is impossible. You cannot have been the dupe of it." "Sire!" "It is impossible. I tell you that the honor, the virtue of my mother can be suspected, and my first minister has not yet done justice on the criminals." "Reflect, sire, before you are hurried away by anger," replied Fouquet. "The birth of your brother—" "I have only one brother, and that is Monsieur. You know it as well as myself. There is a plot, I tell you, beginning with the governor of the Bastile." "Be careful, sire, for this man has been deceived as every one else has by the prince's likeness to yourself." "Likeness? Absurd!" "This Marchiali must be singularly like your majesty, to be able to deceive every one's eye," Fouquet persisted. "Ridiculous!" "Do not say so, sire. Those who had prepared everything in order to face and deceive your ministers, your mother, your officers of state, the members of your family, must be quite confident of the resemblance between you." "But where are these persons, then?" murmured the king. "At Vaux." "At Vaux? And you suffer them to remain there?" "My most instant duty appeared to me to be your majesty's release. I have accomplished that duty, and now, whatever your majesty may command, shall be done. I await your orders." Louis reflected for a few moments. "Muster all the troops in Paris," he said. All the necessary orders are given for that purpose," replied Fouquet. "You have given orders?" exclaimed the king. "For that purpose, yes, sire. Your majesty will be at the head of 10,000 men in less than an hour." The only reply the king made was to take hold of Fouquet's hand with such an expression of feeling that it was very easy to perceive how strongly he had, until that remark, maintained his suspicions of the minister, notwithstanding the latter's intervention. "And with these troops," he said, "we shall go at once and besiege in your house the rebels who by this time will have established and entrenched themselves therein." "I should be surprised if that were the case," replied Fouquet. "Why?" "Because their chief, the very soul of the enterprise, having been unmasked by me, the whole plan seems to me to have miscarried." "You have unmasked this false prince also?" "No, I have not seen him." "Whom have you seen, then?" "The leader of the enterprise, not that unhappy young man. The latter is merely an instrument, destined through his whole life to wretchedness, I plainly perceive." "Most certainly." "It is M. l'Abbe d'Herblay, Evêque de Vannes." "Your friend?" "He was my friend, sire," replied Fouquet, nobly. "An unfortunate circumstance for you," said the king, in a less generous tone of voice. "Such friendships, sire, had nothing dishonorable in them so long as I was ignorant of the crime." "You should have foreseen it." "If I am guilty, I place myself in your majesty's hands." "Ah, Monsieur Fouquet, it was not that I meant," returned the king, sorry to have shown the bitterness of his thought in such a manner. "Well, I assure you that, notwithstanding the mask with which the villain covered his face, I had something like a vague suspicion that he was the very man. But with this chief of the enterprise there was a man of prodigious strength, the one who menaced me with a force almost Herculean. What is he?" "It must be his friend the Baron du Vallon, formerly one of the musketeers." "The friend of D'Artagnan? The friend of the Comte de la Fere? Ah!" exclaimed the king, as he paused at the name of the latter, "we must not forget the connection that existed between the conspirators and M. de Bragelonne." "Sire, sire, do not go too far. M. de la Fere is the most honorable man in France. Be satisfied with those whom I deliver up to you." "With those whom you deliver up to me, you say? Very good, for you will deliver up those who are guilty to me." "What does your majesty understand by that?" inquired Fouquet. "I understand," replied the king, "that we shall soon arrive at Vaux with a large body of troops, and that we will lay violent hands upon that nest of vipers, and that not a soul shall escape." "Your majesty will put these men to death!" cried Fouquet. "To the very meanest of them." "Oh, sire!" "Let us understand one another, Monsieur Fouquet," said the king, haughtily. "We no longer live in times when assassination was the only and the last resource kings held in reservation at extremity. No, Heaven be praised! I have parliaments who sit and judge in my name, and I have scaffolds on which supreme authority is carried out." Fouquet turned pale. "I will take the liberty of observing to your majesty that any proceedings instituted respecting these matters would bring down the greatest scandal upon the dignity of the throne. The august name of Anne of Austria must never be allowed to pass the lips of the people accompanied by a smile." "Justice must be done, however, monsieur." "Good sire, but royal blood must not be shed upon a scaffold." "The royal blood! You believe that?" cried the king, with fury in his voice, stamping his foot on the ground. "This double birth is an invention, and in that invention particularly do I see Monsieur d'Herblay's crime. It is the crime I wish to punish rather than the violence, or the insult." "And punish it with death, sire?" With death. Yes, monsieur, I have said it." "Sire," said the surintendant, with firmness, as he raised his head proudly, "your majesty will take the life, if you please, of your brother Philippe of France. That concerns you alone, and you will doubtless consult the queen mother upon the subject. Whatever she may command will be perfectly correct. I do not wish to mix myself up in it, not even for the honor of your crown, but I have a favor to ask of you, and I beg to submit it to you." "Speak," said the king, in no little degree agitated by his minister's last words. "What do you require?" "The pardon of M. d'Herblay and M. du Vallon." "My assassins?" "Two rebels, sire, that is all." "Oh, I understand, then, you ask me to forgive your friends." "My friends!" said Fouquet, deeply wounded. "Your friends, certainly; but the safety of the state requires that an exemplary punishment should be inflicted on the guilty." "I will not permit myself to remind your majesty that I have just restored you to liberty, and have saved your life." "Monsieur!" "I will not allow myself to remind your majesty that had M. d'Herblay wished to carry out his character of an assassin, he could very easily have assassinated your majesty this morning in the forest of Senart, and all would have been over." The king started. "A pistol bullet through the head," pursued Fouquet, "and the disfigured features of Louis XIV, which no one could have recognized, would be M. d'Herblay's complete and entire justification." The king turned pale and giddy at the bare idea of the danger he had escaped. "If M. d'Herblay," continued Fouquet, "had been an assassin, he had no occasion to inform me of his plan in order to succeed. Freed from the real king, it would have been impossible in all futurity to guess the false. And if the usurper had been recognized by Anne of Austria, he would still have been her son. The usurper, as far as M. d'Herblay's conscience was concerned, was still a king of the blood of Louis XIII. Moreover, the conspirator in that course would have had security, secrecy, impunity. A pistol bullet would have procured him all that. For the sake of heaven, sire, grant me his forgiveness." The king, instead of being touched by the picture, so faithfully drawn in all details, of Aramis's generosity, felt himself most painfully and cruelly humiliated. His unconquerable pride revolted at the idea that a man had held suspended at the end of his finger the thread of his royal life. Every word that fell from Fouquet's lips, and which he thought most efficacious in procuring his friend's pardon, seemed to pour another drop of poison into the already ulcerated heart of Louis XIV. Nothing could bend or soften him. Addressing himself to Fouquet, he said, "I really don't know, monsieur, why you should solicit the pardon of these men. What good is there in asking that which can be obtained without solicitation?" "I do not understand you, sire." "It is not difficult either. Where am I now?" "In the Bastile, sire." "Yes, in a dungeon. I am looked upon as a madman, am I not?" "Yes, sire." "And no one is known here but Marchiali?" "Certainly." "Well, change nothing in the position of affairs. Let the poor madman rot between the slimy walls of the Bastile, and M. d'Herblay and M. de Vallon will stand in no need of my forgiveness. Their new king will absolve them." "Your majesty does me a great injustice, sire, and you are wrong," replied Fouquet, dryly. "I am not child enough, nor is M. d'Herblay silly enough, to have omitted to make all these reflections; and if I had wished to make a new king, as you say, I had no occasion to come here to force open the gates and doors of the Bastile to free you from this place. That would show a want of even common sense. Your majesty's mind is disturbed by anger, otherwise you would be far from offending, groundlessly, the very one of your servants who has rendered you the most important service of all." Louis perceived that he had gone too far, that the gates of the Bastille were still closed upon him, whilst by degrees the floodgates were gradually being opened, behind which the generous hearted Fouquet had restrained his anger. "I did not say that to humiliate you, Heaven knows, monsieur," he replied. "Only you are addressing yourself to me in order to obtain a pardon, and I answer according to my conscience. And so, judging by my conscience, the criminals we speak of are not worthy of consideration or forgiveness." Fouquet was silent. "What I do is as generous," added the king, "as what you have done, for I am in your power. I will even say it is more generous, inasmuch as you place before me certain conditions upon which my liberty, my life, may depend, and to reject which is to make a sacrifice of both." "I was wrong, certainly," replied Fouquet. "Yes, I had the appearance of extorting a favor. I regret it, and entreat your majesty's forgiveness." "And you are forgiven, my dear Monsieur Fouquet," said the king with a smile which restored the serene expression of his features, which so many circumstances had altered during the preceding evening. "I have my own forgiveness," replied the minister, with some degree of persistence, "but Monsieur d'Herblay and Monsieur du Vallon?" "They will never obtain theirs, as long as I live," replied the inflexible king. "Do me the kindness not to speak of it again." "Your majesty shall be obeyed." "And you will bear me no ill will for it?" "Oh, no, sire, for I anticipated the event." "You had anticipated that I should refuse to forgive those gentlemen?" "Certainly, and all my measures were taken in consequence." "What do you mean to say?" cried the king, surprised. "Monsieur d'Herblay came, as may be said, to deliver himself into my hands. Monsieur d'Herblay left to me the happiness of saving my king and my country. I could not condemn Monsieur d'Herblay to death, nor could I, on the other hand, expose him to your majesty's justifiable wrath. It would have been just the same as if I had killed him myself." "Well, and what have you done?" "Sire, I gave Monsieur d'Herblay the best horses in my stables, and 4 hours' start over all those your majesty might, probably, dispatch after him." "Be it so," murmured the king. "But still, the world is wide enough and large enough for those whom I may send to overtake your horses, notwithstanding the 4 hours' start which you have given to Monsieur d'Herblay." "In giving him these 4 hours, sire, I knew I was giving him his life, and he will save his life." "In what way?" "After having galloped as hard as possible, with the 4 hours' start, before your musketeers, he will reach my chateau of Belle Isle, where I have given him a safe asylum." "That may be, but you forget that you have made me a present of Belle Isle." "But not for you to arrest my friends." "You take it back again, then?" "As far as that goes, yes, sire." "My musketeers shall capture it, and the affair will be at an end." "Neither your musketeers nor your whole army could take Belle Isle," said Fouquet, coldly. "Belle Isle is impregnable." The king became perfectly livid. A lightning flash seemed to dart from his eyes. Fouquet felt that he was lost, but he was not one to shrink when the voice of honor spoke loudly within him. He bore the king's wrathful gaze. The other swallowed his rage, and after a few moments' silence, said, "Are we going to return to Vaux?" "I am at your majesty's orders," replied Fouquet, with a low bow; "but I think that your majesty can hardly dispense with changing your clothes previous to appearing before your court." "We shall pass by the Louvre," said the king. "Come." And they left the prison, passing before Baisemeaux, who looked completely bewildered as he saw Marchiali once more leave, and in his helplessness, tore out the major portion of his few remaining hairs. It was perfectly true, however, that Fouquet wrote and gave him an authority for the prisoner's release, and that the king wrote beneath it, "Seen and approve, Louis." A piece of madness that Baisemeaux, incapable of putting two ideas together, acknowledged by giving himself a terrible blow on the forehead with his own fist. Chapter 24. The False King. In the meantime, usurped royalty was playing out its part bravely at Vaux. Philippe gave orders that for his petit lever, the grande entrée, already prepared to appear before the king, should be introduced. He determined to give this order notwithstanding the absence of M. d'Herblay, who did not return. Our readers know the reason. But the prince, not believing that absence could be prolonged, wished, as all rash spirits do, to try his valor and his fortune, far from all protection and instruction. Another reason urged him to this. Anne of Austria was about to appear. The guilty mother was about to stand in the presence of her sacrificed son. Philippe was not willing, if he had a weakness, to render the man a witness of it before whom he was bound thenceforth to display so much strength. Philippe opened his folding doors, and several persons entered silently. Philippe did not stir whilst his valet de chambre dressed him. He had watched, the evening before, all the habits of his brother, and played the king in such a manner as to awaken no suspicion. He was thus completely dressed in hunting costume when he received his visitors. His own memory and the notes of Aramis announced everybody to him; first of all, Anne of Austria, to whom Monsieur gave his hand, and then Madame with M. de Saint Aignan. He smiled at seeing these countenances, but trembled on recognizing his mother. That still so noble and imposing figure, ravaged by pain, pleaded in his heart the cause of the famous queen who had immolated a child to reasons of state. He found his mother still handsome. He knew that Louis XIV. Loved her, and he promised himself to love her likewise, and not to prove a scourge to her old age. He contemplated his brother with a tenderness easily to be understood. The latter had usurped nothing, had cast no shades athwart his life. A separate tree, he allowed the stem to rise without heeding its elevation or majestic life. Philippe promised himself to be a kind brother to this prince, who required nothing but gold to minister to his pleasures. He bowed with a friendly air to Saint Aignan, who was all reverences and smiles, and trembling held out his hand to Henrietta, his sister-in-law, whose beauty struck him; but he saw in the eyes of that princess an expression of coldness which would facilitate, as he thought, their future relations. "How much more easy," thought he, "it will be to be the brother of that woman than her gallant, if she evinces toward me a coldness that my brother could not have for her, but which is imposed upon me as a duty." The only visit he dreaded at this moment was that of the queen. His heart, his mind, had just been shaken by so violent a trial, that, in spite of their firm temperament, they would not perhaps support another shock. Happily, the queen did not come. Then commenced, on the part of Anne of Austria, a political dissertation upon the welcome M. Fouquet had given to the house of France. She mixed up hostilities with compliments addressed to the king, and questions as to his health, with little maternal flatteries and diplomatic artifices. "Well, my son," said she, "are you convinced with regard to M. Fouquet?" "Saint Aignan," said Philippe, "have the goodness to go and inquire after the queen." At these words, the first Philippe had pronounced aloud, the slight difference that there was between his voice and that of the king was sensible to maternal ears, and Anne of Austria looked earnestly at her son. Saint Aignan left the room, and Philippe continued, "Madame, I do not like to hear M. Fouquet ill spoken of; you know I do not, and you have even spoken well of him yourself." "That is true; therefore I only question you on the state of your sentiments with respect to him." "Sire," said Henrietta, "I, on my part, have always liked M. Fouquet. He is a man of good taste, a superior man." A superintendent who is never sordid or niggardly," added Monsieur, "and who pays in gold all the orders I have on him." "Every one in this thinks too much of himself, and nobody for the state," said the old queen. "Monsieur Fouquet, it is a fact, Monsieur Fouquet is ruining the state." "Well, mother," replied Philippe in rather a lower key, "do you likewise constitute yourself the buckler of M. Colbert?" "How is that?" replied the old queen, rather surprised. "Why, in truth," replied Philippe, "you speak that just as your old friend Madame de Chevreuse would speak." "Why do you mention Madame de Chevreuse to me?" said she. "And what sort of humor are you in to day towards me?" Philippe continued: "Is not Madame de Chevreuse always in league against somebody? Has not Madame de Chevreuse been to pay you a visit, mother?" "Monsieur, you speak to me now in such a manner that I can almost fancy I am listening to your father." "My father did not like Madame de Chevreuse, and had good reason for not liking her," said the prince. "For my part, I like her no better than he did; and if she thinks proper to come here as she formerly did, to sow divisions and hatreds under the pretext of begging money, why " "Well, what?" said Anne of Austria, proudly, herself provoking the storm. "Well," replied the young man, firmly, "I will drive Madame de Chevreuse out of my kingdom, and with her all who meddle with its secrets and mysteries." He had not calculated the effect of this terrible speech, or perhaps he wished to judge the effect of it, like those who, suffering from a chronic pain, and seeking to break the monotony of that suffering, touch their wound to procure a sharper pang. Anne of Austria was nearly fainting; her eyes, open but meaningless, ceased to see for several seconds; she stretched out her arms towards her other son, who supported and embraced her without fear of irritating the king. "Sire," murmured she, "you are treating your mother very cruelly." "In what respect, madame?" replied he. "I am only speaking of Madame de Chevreuse. Does my mother prefer Madame de Chevreuse to the security of the state and of my person? Well, then, madame, I tell you Madame de Chevreuse has returned to France to borrow money, and that she has addressed herself to M. Fouquet to sell him a certain secret." "A certain secret!" cried Anne of Austria. "Concerning pretended robberies that monsieur le surintendant had committed, which is false," added Philippe. "Monsieur Fouquet rejected her offers with indignation, preferring the esteem of the king to complicity with such intriguers. Then Madame de Chevreuse sold the secret to M. Colbert, and as she is insatiable, and was not satisfied with having extorted 100,000 crowns from a servant of the state, she has taken a still bolder flight, in search of surer sources of supply. Is that true, madame?" "You know all, sire," said the queen, more uneasy than irritated. "Now," continued Philippe, "I have good reasons to dislike this fury, who comes to my court to plan the shame of some and the ruin of others. If Heaven has suffered certain crimes to be committed, and has concealed them in the shadow of its clemency, I will not permit Madame de Chevreuse to counteract the just designs of fate." The latter part of this speech had so agitated the queen mother that her son had pity on her. He took her hand and kissed it tenderly. He did not feel that in that kiss, given in spite of repulsion and bitterness of the heart, there was a pardon for 8 years of suffering. Philippe allowed the silence of a moment to swallow the emotions that had just developed themselves. Then, with a cheerful smile, "We will not go to day," said he; "I have a plan." And turning towards the door, he hoped to see Aramis, whose absence began to alarm him. The queen mother wished to leave the room. "Remain where you are, mother," said he; "I wish you to make your peace with M. Fouquet."
I bear Monsieur Fouquet no ill will. I only dreaded his prodigalities."
"We will put that to rights, and will take nothing of the superintendent but his good qualities."
"What is your majesty looking for?"
said Henrietta, seeing the eyes constantly turned towards the door, and wishing to let fly a little poisoned arrow at his heart, supposing he was so anxiously expecting either La Valliere or a letter from her. "My sister," said the young man, who had divined her thought, thanks to that marvelous perspicuity of which fortune was from that time about to allow him the exercise, "my sister, I am expecting a most distinguished man, a most able counselor, whom I wish to present to you all, recommending him to your good graces. Ah! Come in then, D'Artagnan." "What does your majesty wish?" said D'Artagnan, appearing.
"Where is monsieur the bishop of Vannes, your friend?"
"Why, sire?"
"I am waiting for him, and he does not come. Let him be sought for."
D'Artagnan remained for an instant stupefied, but soon, reflecting that Aramis had left Vaux privately on a mission from the king, he concluded that the king wished to preserve the secret. "Sire," replied he, "does your majesty absolutely require M. d'Herblay to be brought to you?"
"Absolutely is not the word," said Philippe. "I do not want him so particularly as that; but if he can be found—"
"I thought so," said D'Artagnan to himself.
"Is this M. d'Herblay the bishop of Vannes?"
"Yes, madame."
"A friend of M. Fouquet?"
"Yes, madame, an old musketeer." Anne of Austria blushed.
"One of the four braves who formerly performed such prodigies."
The old queen repented of having wished to bite. She broke off the conversation, in order to preserve the rest of her teeth.
"Whatever may be your choice, sire," said she, "I have no doubt it will be excellent."
All bowed in support of that sentiment.
"You will find in him," continued Philippe, "the depth and penetration of M. de Richelieu, without the avarice of M. de Mazarin."
"A prime minister, sire!" said Monsieur, in a fright.
"I will tell you all about that, brother; but it is strange that M. d'Herblay is not here." He called out, "Let M. Fouquet be informed that I wish to speak to him. Oh, before you, do not retire."
M. de Saint Aignan returned, bringing satisfactory news of the queen, who only kept her bed from precaution, and to have strength to carry out the king's wishes. Whilst everybody was seeking M. Fouquet and Aramis, the new king quietly continued his experiments, and everybody, family, officers, servants, had not the least suspicion of his identity, his air, his voice, and manners were so like the king's. On his side, Philippe, applying to all countenances the accurate descriptions and keynotes of character supplied by his accomplice Aramis, conducted himself so as not to give birth to a doubt in the minds of those who surrounded him. Nothing from that time could disturb the usurper. With what strange facility had Providence just reversed the loftiest fortune of the world to substitute the lowliest in its stead! Philippe admired the goodness of God with regard to himself, and seconded it with all the resources of his admirable nature. But he felt, at times, something like a specter gliding between him and the rays of his new glory. Aramis did not appear. The conversation had languished in the royal family. Philippe, preoccupied, forgot to dismiss his brother and Madame Henrietta. The latter was astonished, and began, by degrees, to lose all patience. Anne of Austria stooped toward her son's ear, and addressed some words to him in Spanish. Philippe was completely ignorant of that language, and grew pale at this unexpected obstacle. But, as if the spirit of the imperturbable Aramis had covered him with his infallibility, instead of appearing disconcerted, Philippe arose. "Well, what?" said Anne of Austria. "What is all that noise?" said Philippe, turning round towards the door of the second staircase. And a voice was heard saying, "This way, a few steps more, sire. "The voice of M. Fouquet," said D'Artagnan, who was standing close to the queen mother.
"Then M. d'Herblay cannot be far off," added Philippe.
But he then saw what he little thought to have beheld so near to him. All eyes were turned towards the door at which M. Fouquet was expected to enter, but it was not M. Fouquet who entered. A terrible cry resounded from all corners of the chamber, a painful cry uttered by the king and all present. It is given to but few men, even those whose destiny contains the strangest elements, and accidents the most wonderful, to contemplate such a spectacle similar to that which presented itself in the royal chamber at that moment. The half closed shutters only admitted the entrance of an uncertain light passing through thick violet velvet curtains lined with silk. In this soft shade, the eyes were by degrees dilated, and everyone present saw others rather with imagination than with actual sight. There could not, however, escape, in these circumstances, one of the surrounding details, and the new object which presented itself appeared as luminous as though it shone out in full sunlight. So it happened with Louis XIV, when he showed himself, pale and frowning, in the doorway of the secret stairs. The face of Fouquet appeared behind him, stamped with sorrow and determination. The queen mother, who perceived Louis XIV, and who held the hand of Philippe, uttered a cry of which we have spoken, as if she beheld a phantom. Monsieur was bewildered, and kept turning his head in astonishment from one to the other. Madame made a step forward, thinking she was looking at the form of her brother in law reflected in a mirror, and in fact the illusion was possible. The two princes, both pale as death, for we renounce the hope of being able to describe the fearful state of Philippe, trembling, clenching their hands convulsively, measured each other with looks, and darted their glances, sharp as poignards, at each other. Silent, panting, bending forward, they appeared as if about to spring upon an enemy. The unheard of resemblance of countenance, gesture, shape, height, even to the resemblance of costume, produced by chance, for Louis XIV had been to the Louvre and put on a violet colored dress, the perfect analogy of the two princes, completed the consternation of Anne of Austria. And yet she did not at once guess the truth. There are misfortunes in life so truly dreadful that no one will at first accept them. People rather believe in the supernatural and the impossible. Louis had not reckoned on these obstacles. He expected that he had only to appear to be acknowledged. A living son, he could not endure the suspicion of equality with any one. He did not admit that every torch should not become darkness at the instant he shone out with his conquering ray. At the aspect of Philippe, then, he was perhaps more terrified than any one round him, and his silence, his immobility were, this time, a concentration and a calm which precede the violent explosions of concentrated passion. But Fouquet! Who shall paint his emotion and stupor in presence of this living portrait of his master? Fouquet thought Aramis was right, that this newly arrived was a king as pure in his race as the other, and that, for having repudiated all participation in this coup d'etat, so skillfully got up by the general of the Jesuits, he must be a mad enthusiast, unworthy of ever dipping his hands in political grand strategy work. And then it was the blood of Louis XIII which Fouquet was sacrificing to the blood of Louis XIII. It was to a selfish ambition he was sacrificing a noble ambition. To the right of keeping he sacrificed the right of having. The whole extent of his fault was revealed to him at simple sight of the pretender. All that passed in the mind of Fouquet was lost upon the persons present. He had 5 minutes to focus meditation on this point of conscience. 5 minutes, that is to say, 5 ages, during which the two kings and their families scarcely found energy to breathe after so terrible a shock. D'Artagnan, leaning against the wall, in front of Fouquet, with his hand to his brow, asked himself the cause of such a wonderful prodigy. He could not have said at once why he doubted, but he knew assuredly that he had reason to doubt, and that in this meeting of the two Louis XIVs lay all the doubt and difficulty that during late days had rendered the conduct of Aramis so suspicious to the musketeer. These ideas were, however, enveloped in a haze, a veil of mystery. The actors in this assembly seemed to swim in the vapors of a confused waking. Suddenly, Louis XIV, more impatient and more accustomed to command, ran to one of the shutters, which he opened, tearing the curtains in his eagerness. A flood of living light entered the chamber, and made Philippe draw back to the alcove. Louis seized upon this movement with eagerness, and addressing himself to the queen, "My mother," said he, "do you not acknowledge your son, since every one here has forgotten his king?" Anne of Austria started, and raised her arms towards heaven, without being able to articulate a single word. "My mother," said Philippe, with a calm voice, "do you not acknowledge your son?" And this time, in his turn, Louis drew back. As to Anne of Austria, struck suddenly in head and heart with fell remorse, she lost her equilibrium. No one aiding her, for all were petrified, she sank back in her fauteuil, breathing a weak, trembling sigh. Louis could not endure the spectacle and the affront. He bounded towards D'Artagnan, over whose brain a vertigo was stealing, and who staggered as he caught at the door for support. "A moi, mousquetaire!" said he. "Look us in the face, and say which is the paler, he or I." This cry roused D'Artagnan, and stirred in his heart the fibers of obedience. He shook his head, and without more hesitation he walked straight up to Philippe, on whose shoulder he laid his hand, saying, "Monsieur, you are my prisoner." Philippe did not raise his eyes toward heaven, nor stir from the spot, where he seemed nailed to the floor, his eye intently fixed upon the king his brother. He reproached him with a sublime silence for all misfortunes past, all tortures to come. Against this language of the soul the king felt he had no power. He cast down his eyes, dragging away precipitately his brother and sister, forgetting his mother, sitting motionless within 3 paces of the son whom she left a second time to be condemned to death. Philippe approached Anne of Austria, and said to her, in a soft and nobly agitated voice, "If I were not your son, I should curse you, my mother, for having rendered me so unhappy." D'Artagnan felt a shudder pass through the marrow of his bones. He bowed respectfully to the young prince, and said as he bent, "Excuse me, monseigneur, I am but a soldier, and my oaths are his who has just left the chamber." "Thank you, Monsieur d'Artagnan. What has become of Monsieur d'Herblay?" "Monsieur d'Herblay is in safety, monseigneur," said a voice behind them, "and no one, while I live and am free, shall cause a hair to fall from his head." "Monsieur Fouquet," said the prince, smiling sadly. "Pardon me, monseigneur," said Fouquet, kneeling, "but he who is just gone out from hence was my guest." "Here are," murmured Philippe, with a sigh, "brave friends and good hearts. They make me regret the world. On, Monsieur d'Artagnan, I follow you." At the moment the captain of the musketeers was about to leave the room with his prisoner, Colbert appeared, and, after remitting an order from the king to D'Artagnan, retired. D'Artagnan read the paper, and then crushed it in his hand with rage. "What is it?" asked the prince. "Read, monseigneur," replied the musketeer. Philippe read the following words, hastily traced by the hand of the king: "Monsieur d'Artagnan will conduct the prisoner to the Ile Sainte Marguerite. He will cover his face with an iron visor, which the prisoner shall never raise except at peril of his life." "That is just," said Philippe, with resignation. "I am ready." "Aramis was right," said Fouquet, in a low voice, to the musketeer. "This one is every whit as much a king as the other." "More so," replied D'Artagnan. "He wanted only you and me." Chapter 25, in which Porthos thinks he is pursuing a duchy. Aramis and Porthos, having profited by the time granted them by Fouquet, did honor to the French cavalry by their speed. Porthos did not clearly understand on what kind of mission he was forced to display so much velocity, but as he saw Aramis spurring on furiously, he, Porthos, spurred on in the same way. They had soon in this manner placed 12 leagues between them and Vaux. They were then obliged to change horses, and organize a sort of post arrangement. It was during a relay that Porthos ventured to interrogate Aramis discreetly. "Hush," replied the latter. "Know only that our fortune depends on our speed." As if Porthos had still been the musketeer, without a sou or a maille of 1626, he pushed forward. That magic word fortune always means something in the human ear. It means enough for those who have nothing. It means too much for those who have enough. "I shall be made a duke," said Porthos aloud. He was speaking to himself. "That is possible," replied Aramis, smiling after his own fashion, as Porthos' horse passed him. Aramis felt, notwithstanding, as though his brain were on fire. The activity of the body had not yet succeeded in subduing that of the mind. All there is of raging passion, mental toothache or mortal threat, raged, gnawed, and grumbled in the thoughts of the unhappy prelate. His countenance exhibited visible traces of this rude combat. Free on the highway to abandon himself to every impression of the moment, Aramis did not fail to swear at every start of his horse, at every inequality in the road. Pale, at times inundated with boiling sweats, then again dry and icy, he flogged his horses till the blood streamed from their sides. Porthos, whose dominant fault was not sensibility, groaned at this. Thus traveled they on for 8 long hours, and then arrived at Orleans. It was 4 in the afternoon. Aramis, on observing this, judged that nothing showed pursuit to be a possibility. It would be without example that a troop capable of taking him and Porthos should be furnished with relays sufficient to perform 40 leagues in 8 hours. Thus, admitting pursuit, which was not at all manifest, the fugitives were 5 hours in advance of their pursuers. Aramis thought that there might be no imprudence in taking a little rest, but that to continue would make the matter more certain. 20 leagues more, performed with the same rapidity, 20 more leagues devoured, and no one, not even D'Artagnan, could overtake the enemies of the king. Aramis felt obliged, therefore, to inflict upon Porthos the pain of mounting on horseback again. They rode on till 7 o'clock in the evening, and had only one more post more between them and Blois. But here a diabolical accident alarmed Aramis greatly. There were no horses at the post. The prelate asked himself by what infernal machinations his enemies had succeeded in depriving him of the means of going further. He who never recognized chance as a deity, who found a cause for every accident, preferred believing that the refusal of the postmaster, at such an hour, in such a country, was the consequence of an order emanating from above, an order given with a view of stopping short the kingmaker in the midst of his flight. But at the moment he was about to fly into a passion, so as to procure either a horse or an explanation, he was struck with the recollection that the Comte de la Fere lived in the neighborhood. "I am not traveling," said he. "I do not want horses for a whole stage. Find me 2 horses to go and pay a visit to a nobleman of my acquaintance who resides near this place." "What nobleman?" asked the postmaster. "Monsieur le Comte de la Fere." "Oh!" replied the postmaster, uncovering with respect, "a very worthy nobleman. But, whatever may be my desire to make myself agreeable to him, I cannot furnish you with horses, for all mine are engaged by Monsieur le Duc de Beaufort." "Indeed!" said Aramis, much disappointed. "Only," continued the postmaster, "if you will put up with a little carriage I have, I will harness an old blind horse who has still his legs left, and peradventure will draw you to the house of Monsieur le Comte de la Fere." "It is worth a louis," said Aramis. "No, monsieur, such a ride is worth no more than a crown. That is what M. Grimaud, the comte's intendant, always pays me when he makes use of that carriage, and I should not wish the Comte de la Fere to have to reproach me with having imposed on one of his friends." "As you please," said Aramis, "particularly as regards disobliging the Comte de la Fere. Only I think I have a right to give you a louis for your idea." "Oh! doubtless," replied the postmaster with delight, and he himself harnessed the ancient horse to the creaking carriage. In the meantime Porthos was curious to behold. He imagined he had discovered a clue to the secret, and he felt pleased, because a visit to Athos, in the first place, promised him much satisfaction, and, in the next, gave him the hope of finding at the same time a good bed and good supper. The master, having got the carriage ready, ordered one of his men to drive the strangers to La Fere. Porthos took his seat by the side of Aramis, whispering in his ear, "I understand." "Aha!" said Aramis. "And what do you understand, my friend?" "We are going, on the part of the king, to make some great proposal to Athos." "Pooh!" said Aramis. "You need tell me nothing about it," added the worthy Porthos, endeavoring to reseat himself so as to avoid the jolting. "You need tell me nothing. I shall guess." "Well, do, my friend. Guess away." They arrived at Athos's dwelling about 9 o'clock in the evening, favored by a splendid moon. This cheerful light rejoiced Porthos beyond expression, but Aramis appeared annoyed by it to an equal degree. He could not help showing something of this to Porthos, who replied, I guess how it is. The mission is a secret one." Those were his last words in the carriage. The driver interrupted him by saying, "Gentlemen, we have arrived." Porthos and his companion alighted before the gate of the little chateau, where we are about to meet again our old acquaintances Athos and Bragelonne, the latter of whom had disappeared since the discovery of the infidelity of La Valliere. If there be one saying truer than another, it is this: great griefs contain within themselves the germ of consolation. This painful wound, inflicted upon Raoul, had drawn him nearer to his father again, and God knows how sweet were the consolations which flowed from the eloquent mouth and generous heart of Athos. The wound was not cicatrized, but Athos, by dint of conversing with his son, and mixing a little more of his life with that of the young man, had brought him to understand that this pang of a first infidelity is necessary to every human existence, and that no one has loved without encountering it. Raoul listened again and again, but never understood. Nothing replaces in the deeply afflicted heart the remembrance and thought of the beloved object. Raoul then replied to the reasoning of his father, "Monsieur, all that you tell me is true. I believe that no one has suffered in the affections of the heart so much as you have. But you are a man too great by reason of intelligence, and too severely tried by adverse fortune, not to allow for the weakness of the soldier who suffers for the first time. I am paying a tribute that will not be paid a second time. Permit me to plunge myself so deeply in my grief that I may forget myself in it, that I may drown even my reason in it." "Raoul, Raoul!" "Listen, monsieur. Never shall I accustom myself to the idea that Louise, the chastest and most innocent of women, has been able to so basely deceive a man so honest and so true a lover as myself. Never can I persuade myself that I see that sweet and noble mask change into a hypocritical, lascivious face. Louise lost! Louise infamous! Ah! monseigneur, that idea is much more cruel to me than Raoul abandoned, Raoul unhappy." Athos then employed the heroic remedy. He defended Louise against Raoul, and justified her perfidy by her love. "A woman who would have yielded to a king because he is a king," said he, "would desire to be styled infamous; but Louise loves Louis. Young, both, they have forgotten, he his rank, she her vows. Love absolves everything, Raoul. The two young people love each other with sincerity." and when he had dealt this severe poniard thrust, Athos, with a sigh, saw Raoul bound away beneath the rankling wound, and fly to the thickest recesses of the wood, or the solitude of his chamber, whence, an hour after, he would return, pale, trembling, but subdued. Then, coming up to Athos with a smile, he would kiss his hand, like the dog who, having been beaten, caresses a respected master to redeem his fault. Raoul redeemed nothing but his weakness, and only confessed his grief. Thus passed away the days that followed that scene in which Athos had so violently shaken the indomitable pride of the king. Never, when conversing with his son, did he make any allusion to that scene, never did he give him the details of that vigorous lecture, which might perhaps have consoled the young man, by showing him his rival humbled. Athos did not wish that the offended lover should forget the respect due to his king. And when Bragelonne, ardent, angry, and melancholy, spoke with contempt of royal words, of the equivocal faith which certain madmen drew from promises that emanate from thrones, when, passing over 2 centuries, with that rapidity of a bird that traverses a narrow strait to go from one continent to the other, Raoul ventured to predict the time in which kings would be esteemed as less than other men, Athos said to him, in his serene, persuasive voice, "You are right, Raoul. All that you say will happen. Kings will lose their privileges, as stars which have survived their aeons lose their splendor. But when that moment comes, Raoul, we shall be dead. And remember well what I say to you. In this world, all men, women, and kings must live for the present. We can only live for the future, for God." This was the manner in which Athos and Raoul were, as usual, conversing, and walking backwards and forwards in the long alley of limes in the park, when the bell which served to announce to the comte either the hour of dinner or the arrival of a visitor was rung. And without attaching any importance to it, he turned towards the house with his son, and at the end of the alley they found themselves in the presence of Aramis and Porthos.
Chapter 26. The Last Adieu. Raoul uttered a cry, and affectionately embraced Porthos. Aramis and Athos embraced like old men, and this embrace itself being a question for Aramis, he immediately said, "My friend, we have not long to remain with you." "Ah," said the comte. "Only time to tell you of my good fortune," interrupted Porthos. "Ah," said Raoul. Athos looked silently at Aramis, whose somber air had already appeared to him very little in harmony with the good news Porthos hinted. "What is the good fortune that has happened to you? Let us hear it," said Raoul with a smile. "The king has made me a duke," said the worthy Porthos, with an air of mystery, in the ear of the young man. "A duke by brevet." But the asides of Porthos were always loud enough to be heard by everybody. His murmurs were in the diapason of ordinary roaring. Athos heard him, and uttered an exclamation which made Aramis start. The latter took Aramis by the arm, and after having asked Porthos's permission to say a word to his friend in private, "My dear Athos," he began, "you see me overwhelmed with grief and trouble." "What grief and trouble, my dear friend?" cried the comte. "Oh, what?" "In 2 words. I have conspired against the king. That conspiracy has failed, and, at this moment, I am doubtless pursued." "You are pursued? A conspiracy? Eh? My friend, what do you tell me?" "The saddest truth. I am entirely ruined." "Well, but Porthos, this title of duke, what does all that mean?" "That is the subject of my severest pain. That is the deepest of my wounds. I have, believing in infallible success, drawn Porthos into my conspiracy. He threw himself into it, as you know he would do, with all his strength, without knowing what he was about, and now he is as much compromised as myself, as completely ruined as I am." "Good God! and Athos turned toward Porthos, who was smiling complacently. "I must make you acquainted with the whole. Listen to me," continued Aramis, and he related the history as we know it. Athos, during the recital, several times felt the sweat break from his forehead. "It was a great idea," said he, "but a great error." "For which I am punished, Athos. Therefore, I will not tell you my entire thought. Tell it, nevertheless. It is a crime. A capital crime, I know it is. Lèse majesté. Porthos! Poor Porthos! What would you advise me to do? Success, as I have told you, was certain. Monsieur Fouquet is an honest man, and I a fool for having so ill judged him, said Aramis. Oh, the wisdom of man! Oh, millstone that grinds the world, and which is one day stopped by a grain of sand which has fallen, no one knows how, between its wheels. Say by a diamond, Aramis, but the thing is done. How do you think of acting? I am taking away Porthos. The king will never believe that that worthy man has acted innocently. He never can believe that Porthos has thought he was serving the king, whilst acting as he has done. His head would pay my fault. It shall not, must not, be so. You are taking him away? Whither? To Belle Isle at first. That is an impregnable place of refuge. Then I have the sea, and a vessel to pass over into England, where I have many relations. You, in England? Yes, or else in Spain, where I have still more. But, our excellent Porthos! You ruin him, for the king will confiscate all his property. All is provided for. I know how, when once in Spain, to reconcile myself with Louis XIV, and restore Porthos to favor. You have credit, seemingly, Aramis, said Athos with a discreet air. Much, and at the service of my friends. These words were accompanied by a warm pressure of the hand. Thank you, replied the comte. And while we are on this head, said Aramis, you also are a malcontent. You also, Raoul, have griefs to lay to the king. Follow our example. Pass over into Belle Isle. Then we shall see, I guarantee upon my honor, that in a month there will be war between France and Spain on the subject of this son of Louis XIII, who is an infant likewise, and whom France detains inhumanly. Now, as Louis XIV would have no inclination for a war on that subject, I will answer for an arrangement, the result of which must bring greatness to Porthos and to me, and a duchy in France to you, who are already a grandee of Spain. Will you join us? No. For my part, I prefer having something to reproach the king with. It is a pride natural to my race to pretend to a superiority over royal races. Doing what you propose, I should become the obliged of the king. I should certainly be the gainer on that ground, but I should be a loser in my conscience. No, thank you. Then give me two things, Athos. Your absolution? Oh, I give it to you if you really wish to avenge the weak and oppressed against the oppressor. That is sufficient for me, said Aramis, with a blush which was lost in the obscurity of the night. And now, give me your two best horses to gain the second post, as I have been refused any under the pretext of the Duc de Beaufort being travelling in this country. You shall have the two best horses, Aramis, and again, I recommend poor Porthos strongly to your care. Oh, I have no fear on that score. One word more. Do you think I am maneuvering for him as I ought? The evil being committed, yes, for the king would not pardon him, and you have, whatever may be said, always a supporter in Monsieur Fouquet, who will not abandon you, he being himself compromised, notwithstanding his heroic action. You are right, and that is why, instead of gaining the sea at once, which would proclaim my fear and guilt, that is why I remain upon French ground. But Belle Isle will be for me whatever ground I wish it to be, English, Spanish, or Roman. All will depend, with me, on the standard I shall think proper to unfurl. How so? It was I who fortified Belle Isle, and, so long as I defend it, nobody can take Belle Isle from me. And then, as you have said just now, Monsieur Fouquet is there. Belle Isle will not be attacked without the signature of Monsieur Fouquet. That is true. Nevertheless, be prudent. The king is both cunning and strong. Aramis smiled. I again recommend Porthos to you, repeated the count, with a sort of cold persistence. Whatever becomes of me, count, replied Aramis in the same tone, our brother Porthos will fare as I do, or better. Athos bowed whilst pressing the hand of Aramis, and turned to embrace Porthos with emotion. I was born lucky, was I not? Murmured the latter, transported with happiness as he folded his cloak round him. Come, my dear friend, said Aramis. Raoul had gone out to give orders for the saddling of the horses. The group was already divided. Athos saw his two friends on the point of departure, and something like a mist passed before his eyes and weighed upon his heart. It is strange, thought he, whence comes the inclination I feel to embrace Porthos once more? At that moment Porthos turned round, and he came towards his old friend with open arms. This last endearment was tender as in youth, as in times when hearts were warm, life-happy. And then Porthos mounted his horse. Aramis came back once more to throw his arms round the neck of Athos. The latter watched them along the high road, elongated by the shade, in their white cloaks. Like phantoms they seemed to enlarge on their departure from the earth, and it was not in the mist, but in the declivity of the ground that they disappeared. At the end of the perspective, both seemed to have given a spring with their feet, which made them vanish as if evaporated into cloudland. Then Athos, with a very heavy heart, returned towards the house, saying to Bragelonne, Raoul, I don't know what it is that has just told me that I have seen those two for the last time. It does not astonish me, monsieur, that you should have such a thought, replied the young man, for I have at this moment the same, and think also that I shall never see Messieurs du Vallon and d'Herblay again. Oh, you, replied the count, you speak like a man rendered sad by a different cause. You see everything in black. You are young, and if you chance never to see those old friends again, it will be because they no longer exist in the world in which you have yet so many years to pass. But I. Raoul shook his head sadly, and leaned upon the shoulder of the count, without either of them finding another word in their hearts, which were ready to overflow. All at once, a noise of horses and voices, from the extremity of the road to Blois, attracted their attention that way. Flambeau bearers shook their torches merrily among the trees of their route, and turned round, from time to time, to avoid distancing the horsemen who followed them. These flames, this noise, this dust of a dozen richly caparisoned horses, formed a strange contrast in the middle of the night with the melancholy and almost funereal disappearance of the two shadows of Aramis and Porthos. Athos went towards the house, but he had hardly reached the parterre when the entrance gate appeared in a blaze. All the flambeaux stopped, and appeared to inflame the road. A cry was heard of Monsieur le Duc de Beaufort, and Athos sprang towards the door of his house. But the duke had already alighted from his horse, and was looking around him. I am here, monseigneur, said Athos. Ah, good evening, dear count, said the prince, with that frank cordiality which won him so many hearts. Is it too late for a friend? "Ah, my dear prince, come in," said the count. And, M. de Beaufort leaning on the arm of Athos, they entered the house, followed by Raoul, who walked respectfully and modestly among the officers of the prince, with several of whom he was acquainted. Chapter 27. Monsieur de Beaufort. The prince turned round at the moment when Raoul, in order to leave him alone with Athos, was shutting the door, and preparing to go with the other officers into an adjoining apartment. "Is that the young man I have heard monsieur le prince speak so highly of?" asked M. de Beaufort. "It is, monseigneur." "He is quite the soldier. Let him stay, count, we cannot spare him." "Remain, Raoul, since monseigneur permits it," said Athos. "Ma foi! He is tall and handsome," continued the duke. "Will you give him to me, monseigneur, if I ask him of you?" "How am I to understand you, monseigneur?" said Athos. "Why, I call upon you to bid you farewell." "Farewell?" "Yes, in good truth. Have you no idea of what I am about to become?" "Why, I suppose, what you have always been, monseigneur, a valiant prince and an excellent gentleman." "I am going to become an African prince, a Bedouin gentleman. The king is sending me to make conquests among the Arabs." "What is this you tell me, monseigneur?" "Strange, is it not? I, the Parisian par essence, I who have reigned in the faubourg, and have been called King of the Halles, I am going to pass from the Place Maubert to the minarets of Gigelli. From a frondeur, I am becoming an adventurer. Oh, monseigneur, if you did not yourself tell me that, it would not be credible, would it? Believe me, nevertheless, and we have but to bid each other farewell. This is what comes of getting into favor again." "Into favor?" "Yes. You smile. Ah, my dear count, do you know why I have accepted this enterprise? Can you guess?" "Because your highness loves glory above everything." "Oh, no, there is no glory in firing muskets at savages. I see no glory in that, for my part, and it is more probable that I shall there meet with something else. But I have wished, and still wish earnestly, my dear count, that my life should have that last facet, after all the whimsical exhibitions I have seen myself make during 50 years. For, in short, you must admit that it is sufficiently strange to be born the grandson of a king, to have made war against kings, to have been reckoned among the powers of the age, to have maintained my rank, to feel Henry IV. Within me, to be great admiral of France, and then to go and get killed at Gigelli among all those Turks, Saracens, and Moors." "Monseigneur, you harp with strange persistence on that theme," said Athos in an agitated voice. "How can you suppose that so brilliant a destiny will be extinguished in that remote and miserable scene?" "And can you believe, upright and simple as you are, that if I go into Africa for this ridiculous motive, I will not endeavor to come out of it without ridicule? Shall I not give the world cause to speak of me, and to be spoken of, nowadays, when there are Monsieur le Prince, Monsieur de Turenne, and many others, my contemporaries, I, Admiral of France, grandson of Henry IV., King of Paris, have I anything left but to get myself killed? Cordieu! I will be talked of, I tell you. I shall be killed whether or not, if not there, somewhere else." "Why, monseigneur, this is mere exaggeration, and hitherto you have shown nothing exaggerated, save in bravery." "Peste! My dear friend, there is bravery in facing scurvy, dysentery, locusts, poisoned arrows, as my ancestor St. Louis did. Do you know those fellows still use poisoned arrows? And then, you know me of old, I fancy, and you know that when I once make up my mind to a thing, I perform it in grim earnest." "Yes,
You made up your mind to escape from Vincennes. Ay, but you aided me in that, my master, and, apropos, I turned this way and that, without seeing my old friend, Monsieur Vaugrimaud. How is he?" "Monsieur Vaugrimaud is still your highness's most respectful servant," said Athos, smiling. "I have 100 pistoles here for him, which I bring as a legacy. My will is made, count." "Ah, monseigneur, monseigneur!" "And you may understand that if Grimaud's name were to appear in my will—" The duke began to laugh; then, addressing Raoul, who, from the commencement of this conversation, had sunk into a profound reverie, "Young man," said he, "I know there is to be found here a certain de Vouvray wine, and I believe—" Raoul left the room precipitately to order the wine. In the meantime, M. de Beaufort took the hand of Athos. "What do you mean to do with him?" asked he. "Nothing at present, monseigneur." "Ah! yes, I know, since the passion of the king for La Valliere." "Yes, monseigneur." "That is all true, then, is it? I think I know her, that little La Valliere. She is not particularly handsome, if I remember right." "No, monseigneur," said Athos. "Do you know whom she reminds me of?" "Does she remind your highness of any one?" "She reminds me of a very agreeable girl whose mother lived in the hall." "Ah, ah!" said Athos, smiling. "Oh, the good old times!" added M. de Beaufort. "Yes, La Valliere reminds me of that girl." "Who had a son, had she not?" [Footnote: It is possible that the preceding conversation is an obscure allegorical allusion to the Fronde, or perhaps an intimation that the duke was the father of Mordaunt from 20 years after, but a definite interpretation still eludes modern scholars. "I believe she had," replied the duke, with careless naivete and a complacent forgetfulness, of which no words could translate the tone and the vocal expression. "Now, here is poor Raoul, who is your son, I believe?" "Yes, he is my son, monseigneur." "And the poor lad has been cut out by the king, and he frets." "Still better, monseigneur, he abstains." "You are going to let the boy rust in idleness. It is a mistake. Come, give him to me." "My wish is to keep him at home, monseigneur. I have no longer anything in the world but him, and as long as he likes to remain." "Well, well," replied the duke, "I could, nevertheless, have soon put matters to rights again. I assure you, I think he has in him the stuff of which marechals of France are made. I have seen more than one produced from less likely rough material." "That is very possible, monseigneur; but it is the king who makes marechals of France, and Raoul will never accept anything of the king." Raoul interrupted this conversation by his return. He preceded Grimaud, whose still steady hands carried the plateau with one glass and a bottle of the duke's favorite wine. On seeing his old protege, the duke uttered an exclamation of pleasure. "Grimaud! Good evening, Grimaud!" said he. "How goes it?" The servant bowed profoundly, as much gratified as his noble interlocutor. "Two old friends!" said the duke, shaking honest Grimaud's shoulder after a vigorous fashion, which was followed by another still more profound and delighted bow from Grimaud. "But what is this, count? Only one glass?" "I should not think of drinking with your highness, unless your highness permitted me," replied Athos, with noble humility. "Cordieu! You were right to bring only one glass. We will both drink out of it, like two brothers in arms. Begin, count." "Do me the honor," said Athos, gently putting back the glass. "You are a charming friend," replied the Duc de Beaufort, who drank, and passed the goblet to his companion. "But that is not all," continued he. I am still thirsty, and I wish to do honor to this handsome young man who stands here. I carry good luck with me, vicomte," said he to Raoul. "Wish for something while drinking out of my glass, and may the black plague grab me if what you wish does not come to pass." He held the goblet to Raoul, who hastily moistened his lips, and replied with the same promptitude, "I have wished for something, monseigneur." His eyes sparkled with a gloomy fire, and the blood mounted to his cheeks. He terrified Athos, if only with his smile. "And what have you wished for?" replied the duke, sinking back into his fauteuil, whilst with one hand he returned the bottle to Grimaud, and with the other gave him a purse. "Will you promise me, monseigneur, to grant me what I wish for?" "Pardieu, that is agreed upon." "I wished, monsieur le duc, to go with you to Gigelli." Athos became pale, and was unable to conceal his agitation. The duke looked at his friend, as if desirous to assist him to parry this unexpected blow. "That is difficult, my dear vicomte, very difficult," added he, in a lower tone of voice. "Pardon me, monseigneur, I have been indiscreet," replied Raoul in a firm voice; "but as you yourself invited me to wish—" "To wish to leave me?" said Athos. "Oh, monsieur, can you imagine—" "Well, mordieu!" cried the duke, "the young vicomte is right. What can he do here? He will go moldy with grief." Raoul blushed, and the excitable prince continued, "War is a distraction; we gain everything by it. We can only lose one thing by it, life; then, so much the worse." "That is to say, memory," said Raoul, eagerly; "and that is to say, so much the better." He repented of having spoken so warmly when he saw Athos rise and open the window, which was, doubtless, to conceal his emotion. Raoul sprang towards the comte, but the latter had already overcome his emotion, and turned to the lights with a serene and impassible countenance. "Well, come," said the duke, "let us see. Shall he go, or shall he not? If he goes, comte, he shall be my aide de camp, my son." "Monseigneur!" cried Raoul, bending his knee. "Monseigneur!" cried Athos, taking the hand of the duke, "Raoul shall do just as he likes." "Oh, no, monsieur, just as you like," interrupted the young man. "Par la corbleu!" said the prince in his turn, "it is neither the comte nor the vicomte that shall have his way, it is I. I will take him away. The marine offers a superb fortune, my friend." Raoul smiled again so sadly, that this time Athos felt his heart penetrated by it, and replied to him by a severe look. Raoul comprehended it all; he recovered his calmness, and was so guarded that not another word escaped him. The duke at length rose, on observing the advanced hour, and said, with animation, "I am in great haste, but if I am told I have lost time in talking with a friend, I will reply I have gained, on the balance, a most excellent recruit." "Pardon me, monsieur le duc," interrupted Raoul. "Do not tell the king so, for it is not the king I wish to serve." "Eh! my friend, whom, then, will you serve? The times are past when you might have said, 'I belong to Monsieur de Beaufort.' No, nowadays, we all belong to the king, great or small. Therefore, if you serve on board my vessels, there can be nothing equivocal about it, my dear vicomte. It will be the king you will serve." Athos waited with a kind of impatient joy for the reply about to be made to this embarrassing question by Raoul, the intractable enemy of the king, his rival. The father hoped that the obstacle would overcome the desire. He was thankful to Monsieur de Beaufort, whose lightness or generous reflection had thrown an impediment in the way of the departure of a son, now his only joy. But Raoul, still firm and tranquil, replied, "Monsieur le duc, the objection you make I have already considered in my mind. I will serve on board your vessels, because you do me the honor to take me with you. But I shall there serve a more powerful master than the king. I shall serve God." "God? How so?" said the duke and Athos together. "My intention is to make profession and become a knight of Malta," added Bragelonne, letting fall, one by one, words more icy than the drops which fall from the bare trees after the tempests of winter. The dictates of such a service would require Raoul to spend the rest of his life outside of France, hence Athos's and Grimaud's extreme reactions. Under this blow Athos staggered, and the prince himself was moved. Grimaud uttered a heavy groan, and let fall the bottle, which was broken without anybody paying attention. M. de Beaufort looked the young man in the face, and read plainly, though his eyes were cast down, the fire of resolution before which everything must give way. As to Athos, he was too well acquainted with that tender but inflexible soul; he could not hope to make it deviate from the fatal road it had just chosen. He could only press the hand the duke held out to him. "Comte, I shall set off in 2 days for Toulon," said M. de Beaufort. "Will you meet me at Paris, in order that I may know your determination?" "I will have the honor of thanking you there, mon prince, for all your kindness," replied the comte. "And be sure to bring the vicomte with you, whether he follows me or does not follow me," added the duke. "He has my word, and I only ask yours." Having thrown a little balm upon the wound of the paternal heart, he pulled the ear of Grimaud, whose eyes sparkled more than usual, and regained his escort in the parterre. The horses, rested and refreshed, set off with spirit through the lovely night, and soon placed a considerable distance between their master and the chateau. Athos and Bragelonne were again face to face. 11 o'clock was striking. The father and son preserved a profound silence towards each other, where an intelligent observer would have expected cries and tears. But these two men were of such a nature that all emotion following their final resolutions plunged itself so deep into their hearts that it was lost forever. They passed, then, silently and almost breathlessly, the hour that preceded midnight. The clock, by striking, alone pointed out to them how many minutes had lasted the painful journey made by their souls in the immensity of their remembrances of the past and fear of the future. Athos rose first, saying, "It is late, then. Till tomorrow." Raoul rose, and in his turn embraced his father. The latter held him clasped to his breast, and said, in a tremulous voice, "In 2 days, you will have left me, my son. Left me forever, Raoul." "Monsieur," replied the young man, "I had formed a determination, that of piercing my heart with my sword; but you would have thought that cowardly. I have renounced that determination, and therefore we must part." "You leave me desolate by going, Raoul." "Listen to me again, monsieur, I implore you. If I do not go, I shall die here of grief and love. I know how long a time I have to live thus. Send me away quickly, monsieur, or you will see me basely die before your eyes, in your house. This is stronger than my will, stronger than my strength. You may plainly see that within 1 month I have lived 30 years, and that I approach the end of my life." "Then," said Athos, coldly, "you go with the intention of getting killed in Africa? Oh, tell me, do not lie." Raoul grew deadly pale, and remained silent for 2 seconds, which were to his father 2 hours of agony. Then, all at once, "Monsieur," said he, "I have promised to devote myself to God, in exchange for the sacrifice I make of my youth and liberty. I will only ask of him one thing, and that is, to preserve me for you. because you are the only tie which attaches me to this world. God alone can give me the strength not to forget that I owe you everything, and that nothing ought to stand in my esteem before you." Athos embraced his son tenderly, and said, "You have just replied to me on the word of honor of an honest man. In 2 days we shall be with M. de Beaufort at Paris, and you will then do what will be proper for you to do. You are free, Raoul. Adieu." And he slowly gained his bedroom. Raoul went down into the garden, and passed the night in the alley of limes. Chapter 28. Preparations for Departure. Athos lost no more time in combating this immutable resolution. He gave all his attention to preparing, during the 2 days the duke had granted him, the proper appointments for Raoul. This labor chiefly concerned Grimaud, who immediately applied himself to it with the goodwill and intelligence we know he possessed. Athos gave this worthy servant orders to take the route to Paris when the equipments should be ready, and, not to expose himself to the danger of keeping the duke waiting, or delaying Raoul, so that the duke should perceive his absence, he himself, the day after the visit of M. de Beaufort, set off for Paris with his son. For the poor young man, it was an emotion easily to be understood, thus to return to Paris amongst all the people who had known and loved him. Every face recalled a pang to him who had suffered so much, to him who had loved so much, some circumstance of his unhappy love. Raoul, on approaching Paris, felt as if he were dying. Once in Paris he really existed no longer. When he reached Guiche's residence, he was informed that Guiche was with Monsieur. Raoul took the road to the Luxembourg, and when arrived, without suspecting that he was going to the place where La Valliere had lived, he heard so much music and respired so many perfumes, he heard so much joyous laughter, and saw so many dancing shadows, that if it had not been for a charitable woman who perceived him so dejected and pale beneath the doorway, he would have remained there a few minutes, and then would have gone away, never to return. But, as we have said, in the first antechamber he had stopped, solely for the sake of not mixing himself with all those happy beings he felt were moving around him in the adjacent salons. And as one of Monsieur's servants, recognizing him, had asked him if he wished to see Monsieur or Madame, Raoul had scarcely answered him, but had sunk down upon a bench near the velvet doorway, looking at a clock, which had stopped for nearly an hour. The servant had passed on, and another, better acquainted with him, had come up and interrogated Raoul whether he should inform Monsieur de Guiche of his being there. This name did not even arouse the recollections of Raoul. The persistent servant went on to relate that de Guiche had just invented a new game of lottery, and was teaching it to the ladies. Raoul, opening his large eyes, like the absent man in Theophrastus, made no answer, but his sadness increased 2 shades. With his head hanging down, his limbs relaxed, his mouth half open for the escape of his sighs, Raoul remained thus forgotten in the antechamber, when all at once a lady's robe passed, rubbing against the doors of a side salon, which opened on the gallery. A lady, young, pretty, and gay, scolding an officer of the household, entered by that way, and expressed herself with much vivacity. The officer replied in calm but firm sentences. It was rather a little love pet than a quarrel of courtiers, and was terminated by a kiss on the fingers of the lady. Suddenly, on perceiving Raoul, the lady became silent, and, pushing away the officer, "Make your escape, Malicorne," said she. "I did not think there was any one here. I shall curse you if they have either heard or seen us." Malicorne hastened away. The young lady advanced behind Raoul, and stretching her joyous face over him as he lay, "Monsieur is a gallant man," said she, "and no doubt—" She here interrupted herself by uttering a cry. "Raoul!" said she, blushing. Mademoiselle de Montalais!" said Raoul, paler than death. He rose unsteadily and tried to make his way across the slippery mosaic of the floor, but she had comprehended that savage and cruel grief, she felt that in the flight of Raoul there was an accusation of herself. A woman, ever vigilant, she did not think she ought to let the opportunity slip of making good her justification. But Raoul, though stopped by her in the middle of the gallery, did not seem disposed to surrender without a combat. He took it up in a tone so cold and embarrassed, that if they had been thus surprised, the whole court would have no doubt about the proceedings of Mademoiselle de Montalais. "Ah, monsieur," said she with disdain, "what you are doing is very unworthy of a gentleman. My heart inclines me to speak to you. You compromise me by a reception almost uncivil. You are wrong, monsieur, and you confound your friends with enemies. Farewell." Raoul had sworn never to speak of Louise, never even to look at those who might have seen Louise. He was going into another world, that he might never meet with anything Louise had seen or even touched. But after the first shock of his pride, after having had a glimpse of Montalais, the companion of Louise, Montalais, who reminded him of the turret of Blois and the joys of youth, all his reason faded away. "Pardon me, mademoiselle. It enters not, it cannot enter into my thoughts to be uncivil."
"Do you wish to speak to me?" said she, with a smile of former days. "Well, come somewhere else, or we may be surprised."
"Oh," said he. She looked at the clock, doubtingly, then having reflected,
"In my apartment," said she, "we shall have an hour to ourselves."
And taking her course, lighter than a fairy, she ran up to her chamber, followed by Raoul. Shutting the door, and placing in the hands of her cameriste the mantle she held upon her arm.
"You were seeking Monsieur de Guiche, were you not?" said she to Raoul.
"Yes, mademoiselle."
"I will go and ask him to come up here, presently, after I have spoken to you."
"Do so, mademoiselle."
"Are you angry with me?"
Raoul looked at her for a moment, then, casting down his eyes, "Yes," said he.
"You think I was concerned in the plot which brought about the rupture, do you not?"
"Rupture!" said he, with bitterness. "Oh, mademoiselle, there can be no rupture where there has been no love."
"You are in error," replied Montalais. "Louise did love you."
Raoul started.
"Not with love, I know, but she liked you, and you ought to have married her before you set out for London."
Raoul broke into a sinister laugh, which made Montalais shudder. "You tell me that very much at your ease, mademoiselle. Do people marry whom they like? You forget that the king then kept for himself as his mistress her of whom we are speaking."
"Listen," said the young woman, pressing the hands of Raoul in her own. "You were wrong in every way. A man of your age ought never to leave a woman of hers alone."
"There is no longer any faith in the world, then," said Raoul.
"No, vicomte," said Montalais, quietly. "Nevertheless, let me tell you that, if, instead of loving Louise coldly and philosophically, you had endeavored to awaken her to love."
"Enough, I pray you, mademoiselle," said Raoul. "I feel as though you were all, of both sexes, of a different age from me. You can laugh, and you can banter agreeably. Mademoiselle, I loved Mademoiselle de—"
Raoul could not pronounce her name.
"I loved her well. I put my faith in her. Now I am quits by loving her no longer."
"Oh, vicomte," said Montalais, pointing to his reflection in a looking glass.
"I know what you mean, mademoiselle. I am much altered, am I not? Well, do you know why? Because my face is the mirror of my heart. the outer surface change to match the mind within."
"You are consoled, then?" said Montalais, sharply.
"No, I shall never be consoled."
"I don't understand you, Monsieur de Bragelonne."
"I care but little for that. I do not quite understand myself."
"You have not even tried to speak to Louise?"
"Who? I?" exclaimed the young man, with eyes flashing fire. "I! Why do you not advise me to marry her? Perhaps the king would consent now." And he rose from his chair full of anger.
"I see," said Montalais, "that you are not cured, and that Louise has one enemy the more."
"One enemy the more!"
"Yes, favorites are but little loved at the court of France."
"Oh! While she has her lover to protect her, is not that enough? She has chosen him of such a quality that her enemies cannot prevail against her." But stopping all at once, "And then she has you for a friend, mademoiselle," added he, with a shade of irony which did not glide off the cuirass.
"Who? I? Oh, no! I am no longer one of those whom Mademoiselle de la Valliere condescends to look upon, but—"
This but, so big with menace and with storm, this but, which made the heart of Raoul beat, such griefs did it presage for her, whom lately he loved so dearly, this terrible but, so significant in a woman like Montalais, was interrupted by a moderately loud noise heard by the speakers, proceeding from the alcove behind the wainscoting. Montalais turned to listen, and Raoul was already rising, when a lady entered the room quietly by the secret door, which she closed after her. "Madame!" exclaimed Raoul, on recognizing the sister in law of the king.
"Stupid wretch!"
murmured Montalais, throwing herself but too late before the princess.
"I have been mistaken in an hour."
She had, however, time to warn the princess, who was walking towards Raoul.
"Monsieur de Bragelonne, madame."
And at these words the princess drew back, uttering a cry in her turn.
"Your royal highness," said Montalais, with volubility, "is kind enough to think of this lottery, and—"
The princess began to lose countenance. Raoul hastened his departure, without divining all, but he felt that he was in the way. Madame was preparing a word of transition to recover herself, when a closet opened in front of the alcove, and M. de Guiche issued, all radiant, also from that closet. The palest of the four, we must admit, was still Raoul. The princess, however, was near fainting, and was obliged to lean upon the foot of the bed for support. No one ventured to support her. This scene occupied several minutes of terrible suspense. But Raoul broke it. He went up to the count, whose inexpressible emotion made his knees tremble, and taking his hand, "Dear count," said he, "tell madame I am too unhappy not to merit pardon. Tell her, also, that I have loved in the course of my life, and that the horror of the treachery that has been practiced on me renders me inexorable towards all other treachery that may be committed around me. This is why, mademoiselle," said he, smiling to Montalais, "I never would divulge the secret of the visits of my friend to your apartment. Obtain from madame, who is so clement and so generous, obtain her pardon. For you whom she has just surprised also. You are both free. Love each other. Be happy." The princess felt for a moment a despair that cannot be described. It was repugnant to her, notwithstanding the exquisite delicacy which Raoul had exhibited, to feel herself at the mercy of one who had discovered such an indiscretion. It was equally repugnant to her to accept the evasion offered by this delicate deception. Agitated, nervous, she struggled against the double stings of these two troubles. Raoul comprehended her position, and came once more to her aid. Bending his knee before her, "Madame," said he, in a low voice, In 2 days I shall be far from Paris. In a fortnight I shall be far from France, where I shall never be seen again." "Are you going away, then?" said she, with great delight. "With M. de Beaufort." "Into Africa!" cried De Guiche in his turn. "You, Raoul! Oh, my friend! Into Africa, where everybody dies!" And forgetting everything, forgetting that forgetfulness itself compromised the princess more eloquently than his presence, "Ingrate!" said he, "and you have not even consulted me!" And he embraced him, during which time Montalais had led away Madame, and disappeared herself. Raoul passed his hand over his brow, and said with a smile, "I have been dreaming." Then warmly to Guiche, who by degrees absorbed him, "My friend," said he, "I conceal nothing from you, who are the elected of my heart. I am going to seek death in yonder country. Your secret will not remain in my breast more than a year." "Ah, Raoul, a man!" "Do you know what is my thought, count? This is it: I shall live more vividly, being buried beneath the earth, than I have lived for this month past. We are Christians, my friend, and if such sufferings were to continue, I would not be answerable for the safety of my soul." De Guiche was anxious to raise objections. "Not one word more on my account," said Raoul. "But advice to you, dear friend. What I am going to say to you is of much greater importance." "What is that?" "Without doubt, you risk much more than I do, because you love." "Oh!" "It is a joy so sweet to me to be able to speak to you thus. Well, then, De Guiche, beware of Montalais." "What! Of that kind friend?" "She was the friend of her you know of. She ruined her by pride." "You are mistaken." "And now, when she has ruined her, she would ravish from her the only thing that renders that woman excusable in my eyes." "What is that?" "Her love." "What do you mean by that?" "I mean that there is a plot formed against her who is the mistress of the king, a plot formed in the very house of Madame." "Can you think so?" "I am certain of it." "By Montalais?" "Take her as the least dangerous of the enemies I dread for the other." "Explain yourself clearly, my friend, and if I can understand you—" "In 2 words. Madame has been long jealous of the king." "I know she has." "Oh, fear nothing. You are beloved. You are beloved, count. Do you feel the value of these 3 words? They signify that you can raise your head, that you can sleep tranquilly, that you can thank God every minute of your life. You are beloved. That signifies that you may hear everything, even the counsel of a friend who wishes to preserve your happiness. You are beloved, De Guiche, you are beloved. You do not endure these atrocious nights, those nights without end, which, with arid eye and fainting heart, others pass through who are destined to die. You will live long, if you act like the miser who, bit by bit, crumb by crumb, collects and heaps up diamonds and gold. You are beloved. Allow me to tell you what you must do that you may be beloved forever." De Guiche contemplated for some time this unfortunate young man, half mad with despair, till there passed through his heart something like remorse at his own happiness. Raoul suppressed his feverish excitement, to assume the voice and countenance of an impassible man. "They will make her, whose name I should wish still to be able to pronounce, they will make her suffer. Swear to me that you will not second them in anything, but that you will defend her when possible, as I would have done myself." "I swear I will." replied De Guiche. "And," continued Raoul, "some day, when you shall have rendered her a great service, some day when she shall thank you, promise me to say these words to her: 'I have done you this kindness, madame, at the warm request of M. de Bragelonne, whom you so deeply injured.'" "I swear I will," murmured De Guiche. "That is all. Adieu. I set out to morrow, or the day after, for Toulon. If you have a few hours to spare, give them to me." "All!" cried the young man. "Thank you." "And what are you going to do now?" "I am going to meet monsieur le comte at Planchet's residence, where we hope to find Monsieur d'Artagnan." "Monsieur d'Artagnan?" "Yes, I wish to embrace him before my departure. He is a brave man, who loves me dearly. Farewell, my friend. You are expected, no doubt. You will find me, when you wish, at the lodgings of the comte. Farewell." The two young men embraced. Those who chanced to see them both thus would not have hesitated to say, pointing to Raoul, "That is the happy man." Chapter 29. Planchet's Inventory. Athos, during the visit made to the Luxembourg by Raoul, had gone to Planchet's residence to inquire after D'Artagnan. The comte, on arriving at the Rue des Lombards, found the shop of the grocer in great confusion, but it was not the encumberment of a lucky sale, or that of an arrival of goods. Planchet was not enthroned, as usual, on sacks and barrels. No, a young man with a pen behind his ear, and another with an account book in his hand, were setting down a number of figures, whilst a third counted and weighed. An inventory was being taken. Athos, who had no knowledge of commercial matters, felt himself a little embarrassed by material obstacles and the majesty of those who were thus employed. He saw several customers sent away, and asked himself whether he, who came to buy nothing, would not be more properly deemed importunate. He therefore asked very politely if he could see M. Planchet. The reply, quite carelessly given, was that M. Planchet was packing his trunks. These words surprised Athos. "What, his trunks?" said he. "Is M. Planchet going away?" "Yes, monsieur, directly." "Then, if you please, inform him that M. le Comte de la Fere desires to speak to him for a moment." At the mention of the comte's name, one of the young men, no doubt accustomed to hear it pronounced with respect, immediately went to inform Planchet. It was at this moment that Raoul, after his painful scene with Montalais and De Guiche, arrived at the grocer's house. Planchet left his job directly he received the comte's message. "Ah, monsieur le comte!" exclaimed he, "how glad I am to see you! What good star brings you here?" "My dear Planchet," said Athos, pressing the hand of his son, whose sad look he silently observed, "we are come to learn of you. But in what confusion do I find you? You are as white as a miller. Where have you been rummaging?" "Ah, diable! Take care, monsieur. Don't come near me till I have well shaken myself." "What for? Flour or dust only whiten." "No, no. What you see on my arms is arsenic." "Arsenic?" "Yes, I am taking my precautions against rats." I suppose in an establishment like this, rats play a conspicuous part." "It is not with this establishment I concern myself, monsieur le comte. The rats have robbed me of more here than they will ever rob me of again." "What do you mean?" "Why, you may have observed, monsieur, my inventory is being taken." "Are you leaving trade, then?" "Eh? Mon Dieu! Yes, I have disposed of my business to one of my young men." "Bah! You are rich, then, I suppose?" "Monsieur, I have taken a dislike to the city. I don't know whether it is because I am growing old, or as M. d'Artagnan one day said, When we grow old, we more often think of the adventures of our youth. But for some time past I have felt myself attracted towards the country and gardening. I was a countryman formerly." And Planchet marked this confession with a rather pretentious laugh for a man making profession of humility. Athos made a gesture of approval, and then added, "You are going to buy an estate, then?" "I have bought one, monsieur." "Ah, that is still better." "A little house at Fontainebleau, with something like 20 acres of land round it." "Very well, Planchet. Accept my compliments on your acquisition." "But, monsieur, we are not comfortable here. The cursed dust makes you cough. Corbleu! I do not wish to poison the most worthy gentleman in the kingdom." Athos did not smile at this little pleasantry which Planchet had aimed at him, in order to try his strength in mundane facetiousness. "Yes," said Athos, "let us have a little talk by ourselves. In your own room, for example. You have a room, have you not?" "Certainly, monsieur le comte." "Upstairs, perhaps?" And Athos, seeing Planchet a little embarrassed, wished to relieve him by going first. "It is, but," said Planchet, hesitating. Athos was mistaken in the cause of this hesitation, and, attributing it to a fear the grocer might have of offering humble hospitality, never mind," said he, still going up. "The dwelling of a tradesman in this quarter is not expected to be a palace. Come on." Raoul nimbly preceded him and entered first. Two cries were heard simultaneously, we may say three. One of these cries dominated the others; it emanated from a woman. Another proceeded from the mouth of Raoul. It was an exclamation of surprise. He had no sooner uttered it than he shut the door sharply. The third was from fright; it came from Planchet. "I ask your pardon," added he, "Madame is dressing." Raoul had no doubt seen that what Planchet said was true, for he turned round to go downstairs again. "Madame," said Athos. "Oh, pardon me, Planchet, I did not know that you had upstairs." "It is Truchen," added Planchet, blushing a little. "It is whoever you please, my good Planchet, but pardon my rudeness." No, go up now, gentlemen." "We will do no such thing," said Athos. "Oh, madame, having noticed, has had time—" "No, Planchet, farewell." "Eh, gentlemen, you would not disoblige me by thus standing on the staircase, or by going away without having sat down." "If we had known you had a lady upstairs," replied Athos, with his customary coolness, "we would have asked permission to pay our respects to her." Planchet was so disconcerted by this little extravagance, that he forced the passage, and himself opened the door to admit the comte and his son. Truchen was quite dressed, in the costume of the shopkeeper's wife, rich yet coquettish. German eyes attacking French eyes. She left the apartment after two courtesies, and went down into the shop, but not without having listened at the door, to know what Planchet's gentlemen visitors would say of her. Athos suspected that, and therefore turned the conversation accordingly. Planchet, on his part, was burning to give explanations, which Athos avoided. But, as certain tenacities are stronger than others, Athos was forced to hear Planchet recite his idyls of felicity, translated into a language more chaste than that of Longus. So Planchet related how Truchen had charmed the years of his advancing age, and brought good luck to his business, as Ruth did to Boaz. "You want nothing now, then, but heirs to your property." "If I had one, he would have 300,000 livres," said Planchet. "Humph! You must have one, then," said Athos, phlegmatically, "if only to prevent your little fortune being lost." This word little fortune placed Planchet in his rank, like the voice of the sergeant when Planchet was but a piqueur in the regiment of Piedmont, in which Rochefort had placed him. Athos perceived that the grocer would marry Truchen, and in spite of fate, establish a family. This appeared the more evident to him when he learned that the young man to whom Planchet was selling the business was her cousin. Having heard all that was necessary of the happy prospects of the retiring grocer, "What is Monsieur d'Artagnan about?" said he. "He is not at the Louvre." "Ah, Monsieur le Comte, Monsieur d'Artagnan has disappeared." "Disappeared!" said Athos, in surprise. "Oh, monsieur, we know what that means." "But I do not know." "Whenever Monsieur d'Artagnan disappears, it is always for some mission or some great affair." "Has he said anything to you about it?" "Never." "You were acquainted with his departure for England formerly, were you not?" "On account of the speculation," said Planchet, heedlessly. "The speculation?" I mean," interrupted Planchet, quite confused. "Well, well, neither your affairs nor that of your master are in question. The interest we take in him alone has induced me to apply to you. Since the captain of the musketeers is not here, and as we cannot learn from you where we are likely to find Monsieur d'Artagnan, we will take our leave of you. Au revoir, Planchet, au revoir. Let us be gone, Raoul." "Monsieur le comte, I wish I were able to tell you." "Oh, not at all. I am not the man to reproach a servant with discretion." This word servant struck rudely on the ears of the demi millionaire Planchet, but natural respect and bonhomie prevailed over pride. "There is nothing indiscreet in telling you, monsieur le comte. Monsieur d'Artagnan came here the other day." "Aha!" "And remained several hours consulting a geographical chart." "You are right, then, my friend. Say no more about it." "And the chart there is a proof," added Planchet, who went to fetch from the neighboring wall, where it was suspended by a twist, forming a triangle with the bar of the window to which it was fastened, the plan consulted by the captain on his last visit to Planchet. This plan, which he had brought to the comte, was a map of France, upon which the practiced eye of that gentleman discovered an itinerary marked out with small pins. Wherever a pin was missing, a hole denoted its having been there. Athos, by following with his eye the pins and holes, saw that D'Artagnan had taken the direction of the south, and gone as far as the Mediterranean, towards Toulon. It was near Cannes that the marks and the punctured places ceased. The Comte de la Fere puzzled his brains for some time, to divine what the musketeer could be going to do at Cannes, and what motive could have led him to examine the banks of the Var. The reflection of Athos suggested nothing. His accustomed perspicacity was at fault. Raoul's researches were not more successful than his father's. "Never mind," said the young man to the comte, who silently, and with his finger, had made him understand the route of D'Artagnan. "We must confess that there is a providence always occupied in connecting our destiny with that of Monsieur d'Artagnan. There he is on the coast of Cannes, and you, monsieur, will at least conduct me as far as Toulon. Be assured that we shall meet with him more easily upon our route than on this map." Then, taking leave of Planchet, who was scolding his shopmen, even the cousin of Truchen, his successor, the gentlemen set out to pay a visit to M. de Beaufort. On leaving the grocer's shop, they saw a coach, the future depository of the charms of Mademoiselle Truchen and Planchet's bags of crowns. "Every one journeys toward happiness by the route he chooses," said Raoul, in a melancholy tone. "Road to Fontainebleau," cried Planchet to his coachman. Chapter 30. The inventory of M. de Beaufort. To have talked of D'Artagnan with Planchet, to have seen Planchet quit Paris to bury himself in his country retreat, had been for Athos and his son like a last farewell to the noise of the capital, to their life of former days. What, in fact, did these men leave behind them? One of whom had exhausted the past age in glory, and the other the present age in misfortune. Evidently neither of them had anything to ask of his contemporaries. They had only to pay a visit to M. de Beaufort, and arrange with him the particulars of departure. The duke was lodged magnificently in Paris. He had one of those superb establishments pertaining to great fortunes, the like of which certain old men remembered to have seen in all their glory in the times of wasteful liberality of Henry III's reign. Then, really, several great nobles were richer than the king. They knew it, used it, and never deprived themselves of the pleasure of humiliating his royal majesty when they had an opportunity. It was this egotistical aristocracy Richelieu had constrained to contribute, with its blood, its purse, and its duties, to what was from his time styled the king's service. From Louis XI., that terrible mower down of the great, to Richelieu, how many families had raised their heads? How many, from Richelieu to Louis XIV., had bowed their heads, never to raise them again? But M. de Beaufort was born a prince, and of a blood which is not shed upon scaffolds, unless by the decree of peoples, a prince who had kept up a grand style of living. How did he maintain his horses, his people, and his table? Nobody knew, himself less than others. Only there were then privileges for the sons of kings, to whom nobody refused to become a creditor, whether from respect or the persuasion that they would some day be paid. Athos and Raoul found the mansion of the duke in as much confusion as that of Planchet. The duke likewise was making his inventory. That is to say, he was distributing to his friends everything of value he had in his house. Owing nearly 2 millions, an enormous amount in those days, M. de Beaufort had calculated that he could not set out for Africa without a good round sum, and, in order to find that sum, he was distributing to his old creditors plate, arms, jewels, and furniture, which was more magnificent in selling it, and brought him back double. In fact, how could a man to whom 10,000 livres were owing refuse to carry away a present worth 6,000, enhanced in estimation from having belonged to a descendant of Henry IV? And how, after having carried away that present, could he refuse 10,000 livres more to this generous noble? This, then, was what had happened. The duke had no longer a dwelling house; that had become useless to an admiral whose place of residence is his ship. He had no longer need of superfluous arms, when he was placed amidst his cannons; no more jewels, which the sea might rob him of, but he had 300,000 or 400,000 crowns fresh in his coffers. And throughout the house there was a joyous movement of people who believed they were plundering monseigneur. The prince had, in a supreme degree, the art of making happy the creditors most to be pitied. Every distressed man, every empty purse, found in him patience and sympathy for his position. To some he said, "I wish I had what you have, I would give it you." And to others, "I have but this silver ewer, it is worth at least 500 livres. Take it." The effect of which was, so truly is courtesy a current payment, that the prince constantly found means to renew his creditors. This time he used no ceremony; it might be called a general pillage. He gave up everything. The oriental fable of the poor Arab who carried away from the pillage of palace a kettle at the bottom of which was concealed a bag of gold, and whom everybody allowed to pass without jealousy, this fable had become a truth in the prince's mansion. Many contractors paid themselves upon the offices of the duke. Thus, the provision department, who plundered the clothes presses and the harness rooms, attached very little value to things which tailors and saddlers set great store by. Anxious to carry home to their wives presents given them by monseigneur, many were seen bounding joyously along, under the weight of earthen jars and bottles, gloriously stamped with the arms of the prince. M. de Beaufort finished by giving away his horses and the hay from his lofts. He made more than 30 happy with kitchen utensils, and 30 more with the contents of his cellar. Still further, all these people went away with the conviction that M. de Beaufort only acted in this manner to prepare for a new fortune concealed beneath the Arabs' tents. They repeated to each other, while pillaging his hotel, that he was sent to Gigeli by the king to reconstruct his lost fortunes, that the treasures of Africa would be equally divided between the admiral and the king of France, that these treasures consisted in mines of diamonds, or other fabulous stones. The gold and silver mines of Mount Atlas did not even obtain the honor of being named. In addition to the mines to be worked, which could not be begun till after the campaign, there would be the booty made by the army. M. de Beaufort would lay his hands on all the riches pirates had robbed Christendom of since the battle of Lepanto. The number of millions from these sources defied calculation. Why then should he, who was going in quest of such treasure, set any store by the poor utensils of his past life? And reciprocally, why should they spare the property of him who spared it so little himself? Such was the position of affairs. Athos, with his piercing practiced glance, saw what was going on at once. He found the admiral of France a little exalted, for he was rising from a table of 50 covers, at which the guests had drunk long and deeply to the prosperity of the expedition, at the conclusion of which repast, the remains, with the dessert, had been given to the servants, and the empty dishes and plates to the curious. The prince was intoxicated with his ruin and his popularity at one and the same time. He had drunk his old wine to the health of his wine of the future. When he saw Athos and Raoul, "There is my aide de camp being brought to me," he cried. "Come hither, comte! Come hither, vicomte!" Athos tried to find a passage through the heaps of linen and plate. "Ah, step over, said the duke, offering a full glass to Athos. The latter drank it. Raoul scarcely moistened his lips. "Here is your commission," said the prince to Raoul. "I had prepared it, reckoning upon you. You will go before me as far as Antibes." "Yes, monseigneur." "Here is the order." And de Beaufort gave Raoul the order. "Do you know anything of the sea?" "Yes, monseigneur. I have traveled with monsieur le prince." "That is well. All these barges and lighters must be in attendance to form an escort, and carry my provisions. The army must be prepared to embark in a fortnight at the very latest." "That shall be done, monseigneur." "The present order gives you the right to visit and search all the isles along the coast. You will there make the enrolments and levies you may want for me." "Yes, monsieur le duc." "And you are an active man, and will work freely. You will spend much money." "I hope not, monseigneur." "But I am sure you will. My intendant has prepared the orders of 1,000 livres, drawn upon the cities of the south. He will give you 100 of them. Now, dear vicomte, be gone." Athos interrupted the prince. "Keep your money, monseigneur. War is to be waged among the Arabs with gold as well as lead." "I wish to try the contrary," replied the duke, "and then you are acquainted with my ideas upon the expedition. Plenty of noise, plenty of fire, and if so it must be, I shall disappear in the smoke." Having spoken thus, M. de Beaufort began to laugh, but his mirth was not reciprocated by Athos and Raoul. He perceived this at once. "Ah!" said he, with the courteous egotism of his rank and age, "you are such a people as a man should not see after dinner. You are cold, stiff, and dry, when I am all fire, suppleness, and wine. No, devil take me, I should always see you fasting, vicomte, and you, comte, if you wear such a face as that, you shall see me no more." He said this, pressing the hand of Athos, who replied with a smile, "Monseigneur, do not talk so grandly because you happen to have plenty of money. I predict that within a month you will be dry, stiff, and cold, in presence of your strong box, and that then, having Raoul at your elbow, fasting, you will be surprised to see him gay, animated, and generous, because he will have some new crowns to offer you." "God grant it may be so!" cried the delighted duke. "Comte, stay with me." "No, I shall go with Raoul. The mission with which you charge him is a troublesome and difficult one. Alone it would be too much for him to execute. You do not observe, monseigneur, you have given him command of the first order." "Bah!" "And in your naval arrangements, too." "That may be true. But one finds that such fine young fellows as your son generally do all that is required of them." "Monseigneur, I believe you will find nowhere so much zeal and intelligence, so much real bravery, as in Raoul. But if he failed to arrange your embarkation, you would only meet the fate that you deserve." "Humph! You are scolding me, then." "Monseigneur, to provision a fleet, to assemble a flotilla, to enroll your maritime force, would take an admiral a year. Raoul is a cavalry officer, and you allow him a fortnight." "I tell you he will do it." "He may, but I will go and help him." "To be sure you will. I reckoned upon you, and still further believe that when we are once at Toulon, you will not let him depart alone." "Oh!" said Athos, shaking his head. "Patience, patience." "Monseigneur, permit us to take our leave." "Begone, then, and may my good luck attend you." "Adieu, monseigneur, and may your own good luck attend you likewise." "Here is an expedition admirably commenced," said Athos to his son. "No provisions, no store flotilla. What can be done thus?" "Humph!" murmured Raoul. "If all are going to do as I am, provisions will not be wanted."
"Monsieur," replied Athos, sternly, "do not be unjust and senseless in your egotism, or your grief, whatever you please to call it. If you set out for this war solely with the intention of getting killed therein, you stand in need of nobody, and it was scarcely worth while to recommend you to M. de Beaufort. But when you have been introduced to the prime commandant, when you have accepted the responsibility of a post in his army, the question is no longer about you, but about all these poor soldiers, who, as well as you, have hearts and bodies, who will weep for their country and endure all the necessities of their condition. Remember, Raoul, that officers are ministers as useful to the world as priests, and that they ought to have more charity." "Monsieur, I know it and have practiced it. I would have continued to do so still, but you forget, also, that you are of a country that is proud of its military glory. Go and die if you like, but do not die without honor and without advantage to France. Cheer up, Raoul. Do not let my words grieve you. I love you, and wish to see you perfect." "I love your reproaches, monsieur," said the young man, mildly. "They alone may cure me, because they prove to me that someone loves me still. And now, Raoul, let us be off. The weather is so fine, the heavens so clear, those heavens which we always find above our heads, which you will see more clear still at Gigelli, and which will speak to you of me there, as they speak to me here of God." The two gentlemen, after having agreed on this point, talked over the wild freaks of the duke, convinced that France would be served in a very incomplete manner, as regarded both spirit and practice, in the ensuing expedition; and having summed up the ducal policy under the one word vanity, they set forward, in obedience rather to their will than destiny. The sacrifice was half accomplished.